Like a locomotive, they were streamlined, and the blueprints were drawn up from a dream of mine.
Okay, now that we have a reasonable understanding of animal development, let's look at human development. Now, first of all, we need to understand the male and female anatomy, and then we're going to look at how fertilization takes place, and finally we'll touch a little bit on birth and delivery. Now, first, let's look at the female anatomy. The female anatomy is quite complex, actually. Females are born with all of their eggs embedded in two ovaries. The ovaries, as you can see, are connected to two uterine tubes, often referred to as fallopian tubes. The fallopian tubes, as you could, extend into the uterus, and the uterus, of course, is where the embryo will nest itself, or I should say implant itself, and form the fetus, and the fetus, of course, eventually will be delivered through the cervix and comes out through the vaginal canal. Now, one thing you should keep in mind is that during the process of ovulation, fertilization, and eventually implantation of the little embryo into the endometrium. The endometrium is the lining of the uterus. The lining of the uterus must be intact for the embryo to be able to attach itself and be able to mature into a fetus and, of course, reach maturation. First of all, let's look at the process of ovulation, which takes place once a month in females. Ovulation is the process for releasing an egg into the fallopian tube. If we follow this process from the right, once a month, an immature egg is anointed to go through a development process. And the development process results in the formation of follicles, and these follicles mature to the point that at a given time in the female cycle, that egg is going to be released into the oviduct or fallopian tube. Now, once that egg is released into the fallopian tube, as you can see in number 4, that egg is waiting to be met by a horde of sperm to be fertilized. But you notice that all that support cells, the rest of the follicle, goes off to the right, and it becomes what is referred to as the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum is an important structure that we will note later on, which helps maintain the integrity of the uterus. This structure will degrade if fertilization does not take place. If fertilization takes place, the corpus luteum gets even bigger and produces the necessary chemicals to maintain and prepare the uterus for implantation of the developing embryo. Now that we know what ovulation is, let's see how ovulation works and what controls this process. If you look at ovulation, we see that ovulation takes place about day 14, which is the time when the egg is released into the fallopian tube. What controls this process? How does this really work? All of this is under the control of all of this is controlled by a variety of chemicals either produced by the pituitary gland, like LH and FSH, or produced by the ovaries themselves, like estrogen and progesterone. Now, this is a complex slide, so let me try to carry you through this process. To start with, let's look at the bottom of the slide and see what happens during the menstrual cycle. During the menstrual cycle, as you can see, the endometrium is sloughed off at the beginning of the cycle, and then again builds up to a level of integrity. Now, it is maintaining the integrity of the uterus is going to be vital. Maintaining the integrity of the uterus lining is going to be vital for preparing the surface for attachment of a developing embryo. So, all that we're looking at is designed to maintain the lining of the uterus. So, let's look at the pituitary gland hormones and what happens when those hormones are released. As you can see, the hormones peak, the LH, which is luteinizing hormone, and the FSH, which is the follicle stimulating hormones, peak at about 14 days. And you notice that when they peak, the egg is released into the ovarian tube or the uterine tube or follicle or the uterine follicle. Let me back up. When the egg is released, it is released into the ovarian tube, and all this takes place at the peak of LH and FSH. At the same time this is going on, we see that estrogen and progesterone are also peaking. These two hormones have the responsibility of maintaining the integrity of the lining of the uterus. These two hormones, by the way, are produced by the cells that surround the egg, and eventually most of these hormones are produced by the corpus luteum itself. So, as we look at all of this, we can see this orchestrated relationship between the pituitary gland hormones, the hormones that are produced by the ovary itself, and how all of this coincides with maintaining the lining of the uterus. So, looking at this, when is the best time to try to reproduce? Of course, is during ovulation. How do we know we're ovulating? Look and see how the LH and FSH peak. You can actually go to your local drugstore and buy a kit that measures LH and FSH, and you know exactly when it's time to procreate. Now, let's look at the male anatomy. The male anatomy actually is far more complex than the female anatomy. The male anatomy's total purpose is the production of sperm. To your right, you can see the development of sperm through the process of, if you remember, meiosis, meiosis 1, meiosis 2, and a bunch of little critters are produced, as you can see. At a given time, every minute, 1,000 sperms are produced in the male. And male starts to produce sperm at puberty and continues to produce sperm for the rest of his life. Let's look at the anatomy of a male. To start with, we can see that in the testes are made up of a convoluted seminiferous tubules where sperm are actually produced. From the testes, the sperms move up the epididymis to the vas deferens, where the sperm mature and are transported through various tubules, pick up a variety of fluids from the prostate gland, the seminal vesicles, and the bulbourethral gland, and release the semen, which at a given time will have as many as 500 million sperms, each eager to find an egg to fertilize. So let's review the path of the sperm. The sperm starts in the testes, it moves through the epididymis, it It then follows the vas deferens, picks up a variety of fluids. Now, these fluids are important because these fluids play an important role once the sperm comes in contact in the with the vagina and the vaginal fluids. The fluid that semen has is designed to neutralize the pH, is designed to increase contractions in the female, and is designed to nurture the sperm until the sperm has had an opportunity to do what a sperm does best, of course, which is to fertilize an egg. Now let's look at this little critter called the sperm. The sperm is really a cell. Remember, all of us were once little critters like this. We had a head with no eyes. We had a tail that wagged and an energy source called mitochondria that surrounded the tail, providing, of course, energy for the movement of the tail. So now let's look at how ovulation, fertilization, and implantation takes place, which hopefully will summarize this overall process. To start with, ovulation is the release of an egg into the uterine tube. The egg, as you can see, is surrounded by cells that support the egg, and once the egg comes in contact with sperm, one sperm will enter the egg and fertilize it, fuse, and form the zygote. Very shortly, let me back up. One sperm will only get into an egg. Once a sperm gets into an egg, it locks out the entrance of other sperm. Now the egg will migrate into the fallopian tube, and cleavage initiates. Remember, cleavage is the multiplication of cleavage is the division of cells that form the morula, that form the blastocyst, and so on. At number 3, we are seeing cleavage occurring. And at the end of number 3, we see a small blastocyst that's formed, and this takes place about day 5 or so, day 6, and this blastocyst will now embed itself or implant itself into the uterine wall. Now, maintaining the integrity of the uterine wall is vital. Otherwise, this process cannot occur. So you can see that during this process of ovulation, maintaining of the endometrium is the total goal of the overall process. Because once the endometrium is intact, implantation can take place. And here we're seeing a bunch of sperm all trying to get into an egg. And as we said before, once one sperm gets in, all the other guys are kept out. And this works quite ingeniously in the sense that an electrical field, a force field is formed around the egg, keeping other sperms out. The egg is extremely selective as to who gets in and who does not get in. So let's look at fertilization again. As you can see, the egg is surrounded by a broad spectrum of support cells. These cells will determine which sperm gets in, and once the sperm gets in, the nuclei of the sperm and the nuclei of the egg will fuse, forming the zygote. Here we're looking at implantation. Implantation takes place about 6 days in humans. As you can see, we have at day 6, the blastocyst is formed, and this is basically a package of stem cells. But if you look carefully, we can already see gastrulation starting by the formation of the inner cell mass. Remember, this inner cell mass is going to eventually form the ectoderm, mesoderm, and the endoderm. By day 7, we can see that this entire package now is effectively implanted into the uterine wall. And here we're looking at day 8 and day 9. And day 9 is hard to really truly visualize because this is hidden from view, and that we start to form the embryo itself, and the beginning of the embryonic development is pretty much fully in force now by day 9. So once implantation takes place, we go through the process of the development of the embryo. Now, the embryo develops during the first 2 months. After 2 months, we have a fully developed embryo, and now the embryo, we refer to it as a fetus. So, after 2 months, the embryo is now a fetus. Let me emphasize something, that during the process of organogenesis, which takes place, of course, after gastrulation, in organogenesis, all the little organs start to fall in place. All the organs are in place in the human by the end of 2 months. So at the end of 2 months, all the organs are in place, the heart is beating, except the organs really are not mature yet, they cannot function. So after 2 months, we start the fetal period, and during the fetal period, what is really happening is fairly uneventful. What is really happening is that all the organs slowly mature, and the fetus is growing by leaps and bounds. So now let's look at the fetus. As you can see, this is at the end of 2 months, we're looking at the fetus. It is now firmly embedded into the lining of the uterus, being fed by the umbilical cord and being connected to the uterus by way of the placenta. Now, the placenta is a very complex organ. The placenta is a meshwork of vessels that are designed to nurture the fetus. Now, the placenta's blood does not mix with the fetal blood. The placenta provides oxygen, it provides nutrients, and it takes out waste from the fetus. But the mother's blood and the mother's blood and the blood of the fetus is never truly mixed. Only the fluids from one and the other do mix, but the blood itself never mix. So if we look at the overall process of embryonic development, we can see that by 3 weeks, we're looking at something less than 1/10 of an inch. By 4 weeks after fertilization, we can see that the embryo really is growing quite nicely, and we can start to see features by 5 weeks, 6 weeks, 7 weeks, and by 8 weeks, we're looking at something about the size of an inch. And you can see that this little critter has all of the organs in place. The heart is beating, the blood is circulating, the kidneys are there, the brain is there, and all the little parts and pieces of an organism are in place, but they're not functioning yet. So it takes another X time. Let's move on to the next thing, please. It takes another 7 months for the fetal period to fully take advantage of what has been done, and all that is happening here is that organs are developing 3 months, 5 months, 7 months, 9 months, of course, and it's developing to the point where it has no more place in the uterus. Too much fat is being accumulated, it needs too much nourishment, and this triggers the process for delivery. So after fertilization, let's just kind of look and look at the miracle of life per se, as shown through these images. Here we're looking at a 6-week-old embryo. Now we're looking at an 11-week fetus and 5-month-old fetus. And finally, we're looking at the delivery process. Of course, you can quite readily see how this process works. And it's a real challenge for the fetus to get through. Until modern times, we have to appreciate that almost 10% of women died during childbirth. Until modern surgery came into being, where we could actually do C-sections, which basically opens up the abdominal cavity, the uterus, and pulls the fetus directly out. This process of the baby getting through this small cervix is extremely difficult, and thanks to modern surgery, we've pretty much eliminated problems like this. So let's look at the difficulty of giving birth from the fetus perspective. As you can see, we're looking at the fetus. This fetus is ready to be born. It has matured and is crowded inside the uterus. The fetus has accumulated a tremendous amount of fat, and the fat was important not only to nurture the infant, I should say the fetus, but also provide insulation for the developing nerves that are continuously developing in this developing fetus. You can see that the cervix has to expand to allow for the baby to get through. Now, this is a fairly complex process. A lot of hormones go in to loosen the cervix and allow the baby to get through. Normally, this process goes through without incident. Unfortunately, sometimes the cervix is just not big enough for the fetus to get through. When this happens, of course, we can do a C-section, which basically opens up surgically a hole in the abdomen and pulls the little critter out. Until this technique was developed in modern times, up to 10% of women died, and the babies died because they could not get through this canal, and it's a relatively difficult contortion process.
The cruiser pulls and where the troopers always stop as we die.